The barbed wire sliced through her palm like a knife through butter, and Eleanor Hartley did not even flinch as blood mixed with rainwater and dripped onto the muddy ground beneath her boots. She had been out here for 3 hours now, working the fence line that separated her modest 100 acres from the open range beyond, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. The Wyoming Territory rain came down in sheets, cold and merciless this October afternoon in 1882, turning the earth into a slippery mess and making the metal wire treacherous to handle. But Eleanor could not afford to stop. The fence had to be mended before nightfall, before the cattle wandered off again, before she lost any more of the meager herd that was all she had left of her father's legacy. Her hands were raw, the leather gloves she had started with now so soaked and worn that they offered no protection at all. She had discarded them an hour ago, tossing them into the mud with a frustrated cry that the wind had stolen away. Now her fingers fumbled with the wire, trying to twist it tight around the weathered fence post, but the rain made everything slippery, and the cold had stolen most of the feeling from her hands. Blood welled up from a dozen small cuts, some old and reopened, some fresh and stinging. Eleanor was 23 years old, and she had been alone on this land for 8 months now, ever since her father had died of pneumonia the previous winter. There had been no one else. Her mother had passed when Eleanor was just a girl of 7, and her father had never remarried. He had poured everything he had into this land, into the small ranch he had carved out of the wilderness, and Eleanor had loved him fiercely for it. She had learned to rope and ride before she could properly read, had learned to shoot straight and mend fences and birth calves in the middle of the night. Her father had treated her not as a delicate daughter to be sheltered, but as a partner, teaching her everything he knew about surviving in this harsh country. But knowing how to do something and having the strength and resources to do it alone were two different things entirely. The ranch was failing. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, could see it in the way the herd had dwindled from 40 head to barely 25, could taste it in the beans and cornbread that had become her daily meals because she could not afford anything else. She had no money to hire help, and the neighboring ranchers had made it clear that a woman running a spread alone was an oddity they wanted no part of. Some had offered to buy her out for a fraction of what the land was worth. Others had simply ignored her existence. The wire slipped from her bleeding fingers again, and Eleanor let out a sound that was half sob, half growl of frustration. She grabbed for it, and the barbs caught her palm in 3 places at once, tearing through skin that was already damaged. This time, she did cry out, a sharp gasp of pain that she immediately bit back. She would not give in. She would not let this place defeat her. Her father had not spent 20 years building this ranch only for it to die with him. She bent to the wire again, her vision blurring with rain and exhaustion and tears she refused to shed. Her hands were shaking now, and she could barely grip the pliers she needed to twist the wire tight. The fence post was old, probably needed replacing, but that was a problem for another day. Right now, she just needed to get the wire secured, needed to close this gap before the cattle found it and wandered through. Eleanor was so focused on her task, so consumed by the pain in her hands and the desperation driving her forward, that she did not hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her. She looked up with a start, her heart jumping into her throat, and found herself staring at a man on a big roan gelding. He sat the horse like he had been born in the saddle, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black hat that was pulled low against the rain. A canvas duster hung open over a faded blue shirt and worn denim pants, and there was a bandana tied around his neck. He had a strong jaw darkened with several days of stubble, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage after a rainstorm. Those eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made Eleanor suddenly aware of how she must look, soaked to the skin, covered in mud, her hands bloody, and her dark hair hanging in wet tangles around her face. She straightened up, dropping the wire, and reaching instinctively for the rifle she had left leaning against a nearby post. But she was too slow, her cold fingers fumbling, and the man held up one hand in a peaceable gesture. "Easy there, miss," he said, his voice a low drawl that somehow carried over the sound of the rain. "I am not here to cause trouble." Eleanor's hand closed around the rifle anyway, and she brought it up, not quite pointing it at him, but making it clear that she could. "Then what are you here for?" she demanded. Her voice came out hoarse, rough from disuse. She had not spoken to another person in nearly a week. The cowboy's gaze dropped to her hands, and something flickered across his face. concern, maybe, or pity. Eleanor hated both. "I was passing through, heading toward Laramie," he said. "Saw you out here working in the rain. Thought you might could use some help." "I do not need help," Eleanor said automatically. It was what she always said, what she had been saying for 8 months now. She had learned early that accepting help came with strings attached, with expectations and obligations she could not afford to take on. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, and then his eyes moved past her to the fence. Eleanor followed his gaze and saw what he was seeing: the sagging wire, the gap that was still not closed, the evidence of her struggle written in the mud and blood around her feet. When she looked back at him, there was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet understanding that somehow made her throat tight. "Your hands are bleeding," he said simply. "And that fence needs finishing before dark. Pride is a fine thing, but it will not keep your cattle in." Eleanor wanted to argue. Every instinct she had developed over the past months screamed at her to send him away, to protect herself and her land from any outside interference. But her hands throbbed with pain, and she was so tired, and the fence was still not mended. She looked at this stranger, this cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere, and tried to read his intentions. His face was weathered and lean, marked by sun and wind, but there was something steady in his eyes, something that made her want to trust him, even as her mind warned her against it. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me. You have no reason to stop." The cowboy swung down from his horse, moving with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. He was tall, she realized, probably 6 feet or more, and there was a strength in the way he carried himself that was impossible to miss. He came toward her slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and stopped a few feet away. "Name is James Coulter," he said, "and maybe I do not have a reason, except that it is the right thing to do. I have been where you are, trying to do more than one person can manage alone. Sometimes accepting help is not weakness. Sometimes it is just good sense." Eleanor stared at him, searching for the lie, for the ulterior motive. But all she saw was sincerity, and it disarmed her in a way that nothing else could have. Slowly she lowered the rifle, though she kept it close. "Eleanor Hartley," she said, "this is my land." James nodded, as if she had answered some question he had not asked. "Well, Miss Hartley, how about you let me finish up this fence while you go tend to those hands? They need cleaning and bandaging or they will fester." "I can finish it," Eleanor protested, but even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Her hands were shaking too badly now, and the pain was making her lightheaded. "I am sure you can," James said, and there was no condescension in his tone, just matter-of-fact agreement. "But you do not have to, not today." He reached down and picked up the wire she had dropped, handling it with practiced ease despite the barbs. Eleanor watched as he examined the fence, taking in the problem with a quick, assessing glance. And then he was working, his movements sure and efficient. He pulled the wire tight, twisted it around the post with the pliers she had been struggling with, and moved on to the next section. Within minutes, he had accomplished what she had been fighting with for the past hour. Eleanor stood there in the rain, watching him work, and felt something break loose inside her chest. It was not just relief, though that was part of it. It was something deeper, a letting go of the crushing weight she had been carrying alone for so long. Tears mixed with the rain on her face, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Thank you," she said, so quietly that she was not sure he heard her. But James looked up from the fence and met her eyes, and the small smile he gave her was warm enough to cut through the cold. "You are welcome," he said. "Now, go on inside before you catch your death. I will finish up here." Eleanor wanted to stay, to watch him work, to make sure he did not judge the state of her ranch too harshly. But her hands were screaming now, and she could feel herself starting to shiver uncontrollably. She nodded, picked up her rifle, and turned toward the small cabin that stood a few hundred yards away. She made it perhaps 10 steps before she had to stop and look back. James was still working the fence, his strong hands moving with a competence that made the task look easy. His horse stood nearby, ground-tied and patient, and the rain poured down over everything. Eleanor watched him for a moment longer, memorizing the image, and then she turned and walked home. The cabin was small and drafty, just 3 rooms that her father had built with his own hands. Eleanor stepped inside and closed the door against the rain, and the sudden silence was almost overwhelming. She stood there dripping on the rough wooden floor, staring at her ruined hands, and finally allowed herself to admit how close to the edge she had been. Another few weeks of struggling alone, and she would have lost everything. She moved to the wash basin and poured water from the pitcher, hissing as the liquid hit her torn skin. The cuts were worse than she had thought, deep gouges from the barbed wire mixed with dozens of smaller scratches. She washed them as best she could, gritting her teeth against the pain, and then tore strips from an old petticoat to use as bandages. Her hands looked like something from a battlefield by the time she was done, wrapped in white cloth that was already staining pink in places. Eleanor was just finishing when she heard bootfalls on the porch. She tensed, her hand moving toward the rifle she had propped by the door. But then James called out, "Miss Hartley, I have finished with the fence. Thought I should let you know before I ride on." She opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand, rain dripping from his duster. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 28 or 29, with fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and the kind of outdoor life that aged a person in particular ways. He was handsome, she realized with a start, in a rough, unpolished way that had nothing to do with fine manners or city polish, and everything to do with character written into weathered features. "It is done?" she asked, and hated how hopeful she sounded. "All mended," James confirmed. "The posts are holding, but you will want to replace a few of them come spring. The wood is rotting in places." Eleanor nodded. She had known that, had been putting it off because she lacked the resources to deal with it. "What do I owe you?" she asked. It was a point of pride. She would not accept charity. James shook his head. "Nothing. Call it a good deed for a fellow rancher." "You have a spread around here?" Eleanor asked, surprised. She knew most of the local ranchers by reputation, if not by sight, and she had never heard the name Coulter. "I did once," James said, and something shadowed his expression. "Down in Colorado. Lost it 2 years back when the winter killed most of my herd. I have been working where I can since then, cowboying for other outfits, saving up to start over." There was a story there, Eleanor could tell, layers of loss and hardship that probably matched her own. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. James shrugged, a movement that tried to be casual but did not quite succeed. "That is the way of things sometimes. You build something, and the land takes it back. The trick is figuring out whether to let it break you or make you stronger." Eleanor thought of her father, of the way he had fought this land for 20 years and loved it anyway. "My father used to say that the West was not for the weak or the uncertain, that if you wanted to survive out here, you had to be tougher than the ground you were standing on." "Sounds like a wise man," James said quietly. "He was." Eleanor's throat tightened. "He died last winter. Left me this place and not much else." The understanding in James's eyes was immediate and complete. "So, you have been running it alone." It was not a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. "I do not have money to hire help, and I will not sell. This land is all I have left of him." James was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. The rain was starting to let up, the downpour fading to a steady drizzle. "If you need a hand for a while, I could stay on," he said finally. "I was heading toward Laramie to look for work anyway. Might as well work here as anywhere, and it looks like you could use someone who knows their way around a ranch." Eleanor's heart jumped, hope and caution warring inside her. "I told you, I cannot afford to pay you." "I am not asking for money," James said. "Room and board would be enough for now. And when you sell some cattle in the spring, if you have anything left over, we can talk about wages then." It was too generous, too good to be true. Eleanor searched his face for the catch, for the sign that this was some scheme to take advantage of her situation. But all she saw was honest intention, and the kind of weariness that came from a man who had been wandering too long without a purpose. "Why?" she asked again. "Why would you do this?" James met her eyes, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to still. "Because I know what it is like to lose everything and have to start over. And because I can see that you are a fighter, and fighters deserve a chance. And maybe," he added, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "because I am tired of drifting, and this seems like a place worth stopping for." Eleanor made a decision that she knew could change everything, for better or worse. But something in her gut, some instinct that had kept her alive this long, told her that James Coulter was exactly what he seemed, a good man down on his luck, offering honest help with no strings attached, and God knew she needed the help. "There is a bunkhouse out back," she said. "It is not much, but it is dry, and there is a stove. If you are serious about staying, you are welcome to it." The smile that broke across James's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "I am serious," he said, "and I appreciate the chance, Miss Hartley. If you are going to be working here, you might as well call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," James repeated, and the way he said her name, with that soft drawl, made something warm unfurl in her chest. "I will earn my keep, I promise you that." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and realized that she meant it. James settled his hat back on his head and nodded toward the small barn visible through the rain. "I will get my horse settled and my gear stowed. If it is all right with you, I will start first thing tomorrow. Looks like there is plenty that needs doing." "More than plenty," Eleanor admitted. "The roof on the barn needs patching, and there is a leak in the chicken coop. The cattle need checking, and the water trough has a crack in it, and that is just what needs doing immediately." "Then we had better get started," James said simply. He turned to go, then paused and looked back. "Eleanor, you did a good job out there today. Not many people would have kept fighting the way you did." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, a sensation she had almost forgotten. It had been so long since anyone had offered her praise, had seen her efforts as anything other than a losing battle. "I did not have much choice," she said. "There is always a choice," James replied. "You could have given up. You did not. That says something about who you are." He walked away then, leading his horse toward the barn, and Eleanor stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching him go. The rain had softened to a mist, and the clouds were beginning to break up on the western horizon, letting through slants of golden late-afternoon light. Eleanor looked at her bandaged hands, at the blood and mud staining her clothes, and felt something she had not felt in months: hope. That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. She could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze that had come up after the rain, and, faintly, the sound of movement from the bunkhouse. James was out there, a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything with a simple offer of help. Eleanor knew she should be more cautious, should guard herself better against disappointment and betrayal, but there had been something in James's eyes, in the steady way he had looked at her, and the gentle way he had taken the wire from her bleeding hands, that made her want to trust him. More than that, it made her want to know him, to understand the story behind his weathered face and the losses he had mentioned. She fell asleep thinking about the way he had smiled at her, and for the first time in months, her dreams were not haunted by failure and loss. Eleanor woke before dawn, as she always did, and dressed quickly in the cold morning air. Her hands ached as she pulled on a fresh shirt and her least worn pair of pants, but the bandages had held through the night, and there was no sign of infection. She braided her long dark hair, pinned it up under an old hat that had been her father's, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was crisp and clear, scrubbed clean by yesterday's rain, and the stars were just beginning to fade in the east. Eleanor made her way to the barn to start the morning chores, but stopped short when she saw lamplight already glowing through the cracks in the walls. She pushed open the door and found James inside, forking hay down from the loft for the 2 horses and the milk cow she kept. He looked up when she entered and smiled. "Morning. Hope I did not overstep. Figured I might as well make myself useful." "You are up early," Eleanor said, surprised and a little flustered. She had not expected him to dive straight into work. "Old habits," James said. "Spent too many years working cattle drives and ranch jobs to sleep past dawn. Besides, I told you I would earn my keep." Eleanor moved to help him, but James shook his head. "You go on and start breakfast. Those hands need rest. I can handle the morning feeding." Eleanor wanted to argue, to assert that this was still her ranch and she was not some delicate thing that needed coddling. But her hands were throbbing, and she could see that James was not trying to take over, just trying to help. She nodded and headed back to the cabin, where she built up the fire in the stove and started making coffee and flapjacks. When James came in 20 minutes later, stomping mud from his boots on the porch, the cabin smelled like food and the coffee was boiling. Eleanor poured 2 cups and set out plates, and they sat down at the small table in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. James ate like a man who had missed too many meals, steady and focused, and Eleanor found herself watching him, noticing small things: the scar on his left hand, old and white, the way he held his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it for warmth, the lines of weariness around his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping well. "How long have you been on the road?" she asked. James looked up, considering the question. "Near about 2 years now, since I lost my place. I have worked ranches from Colorado to Montana, done some trail driving, even spent a few months working in a mine when I got desperate enough. But none of it felt right. I kept moving, kept looking for something that felt like home again." "And you think you might find it here?" Eleanor asked, her heart beating a little faster. James met her eyes, and there was something raw and honest in his expression. "I think maybe I already have. This place, what you are trying to do here, it reminds me of why I got into ranching in the first place. It is not about getting rich or building an empire. It is about working with the land, taking care of something, making it grow. That is worth fighting for." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. No one had understood, not the neighboring ranchers who thought she was foolish, not the townspeople who whispered about the poor Hartley girl trying to run a spread alone. But James got it. He saw what she saw in this hard, beautiful land. "My father felt the same way," she said quietly. "He used to say that the land would give back what you put into it, as long as you were willing to work hard and not give up when things got tough." "He taught you well," James said. "Not many people have the grit to keep going when everything is stacked against them." They finished breakfast and went out to survey the ranch in the morning light. James walked the property with Eleanor, taking in the state of the fences, the condition of the barn and outbuildings, the size and health of the small herd of cattle grazing on the hillside. He asked questions about water sources and grazing rotation, about which bulls she had been breeding with and when she planned to bring the herd down from the high pasture. Eleanor answered as best she could, painfully aware of all the things she did not know, all the gaps in her knowledge that her father had not had time to fill before he died. But if James judged her for her ignorance, he did not show it. Instead, he offered suggestions gently, phrasing them as questions rather than criticisms. "Have you thought about moving the herd closer to the creek for the winter? The grass is better there, and it would be easier to keep an eye on them." Or, "That section of fence on the south side looks like it took some damage in the storm. Want me to ride out and check it this afternoon?" By mid-morning, they had developed a plan for the next few weeks, immediate repairs to the most critical infrastructure, followed by preparations for winter. James would handle the heavy work that Eleanor's injured hands made difficult, and Eleanor would focus on the day-to-day management and record-keeping. It was a partnership born of necessity, but it felt right in a way that surprised Eleanor. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to have someone to share the burden with. Over the following days, James proved himself to be everything he had promised and more. He worked from dawn until dark, tackling the endless list of repairs and maintenance with a steady competence that impressed Eleanor deeply. He patched the barn roof and fixed the chicken coop, replaced rotten fence posts, and cleared a clogged irrigation ditch. He was good with the animals, gentle with the horses, and patient with the half-wild cattle that were not accustomed to being handled. And he never complained, never suggested that the work was beneath him or too hard. Eleanor found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way his shoulders moved under his shirt when he swung a hammer, the concentration on his face when he was working out a problem, the small smile he gave her when their eyes met across the yard. She told herself it was just gratitude, just relief at having help after so many months alone. But she knew it was more than that. There was something about James Coulter that drew her in, something solid and real that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father died. For his part, James seemed content to let their relationship develop slowly, without pressure or expectations. He treated Eleanor with a respect that was rare in her experience, listening to her opinions about the ranch and deferring to her judgment, even when he clearly knew more than she did. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of the cabin, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the mountains, and talk about everything and nothing. James told her stories about his life before the ranch, about growing up in Texas and learning to cowboy from an uncle who had driven cattle up the Chisholm Trail. Eleanor told him about her childhood here in Wyoming, about the hard winters and the beautiful summers, about the day her mother died, and the way her father had held her while she cried. Those conversations, quiet and intimate in the gathering darkness, were Eleanor's favorite part of the day. She learned that James had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh when she least expected it, and a thoughtful way of looking at the world that matched her own. She learned that he loved horses more than almost anything, that he had a soft spot for strays and lost causes, and that he had been engaged once, years ago, to a girl who had decided she wanted city life more than she wanted him. "I was bitter about it for a long time," James admitted one evening, his voice quiet. Felt like she had taken my dreams and crushed them. But looking back, I think maybe we wanted different things from the start. She wanted security and comfort, and there is nothing wrong with that. But I wanted adventure. I wanted to build something with my own hands. Those two things do not always go together. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked. Choosing the ranch life? James shook his head. No. Even losing everything, even these past 2 years of drifting, I do not regret it. This is who I am. I just needed to find the right place and the right person to build with. The way he said it, the way he looked at her when he spoke, made Eleanor's heart race. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to know if he was talking about her, about this ranch. But she was afraid of the answer, afraid of hoping for something that might not be real. As October turned into November, the work continued. Eleanor's hands healed slowly, the cuts closing and scabbing over, though they remained tender and prone to reopening if she worked too hard. James had taken over most of the heavy labor, but Eleanor insisted on doing her share, on proving that she was not some helpless woman who needed constant rescue. They fell into a rhythm, a pattern of work and rest that felt as natural as breathing. The neighboring ranchers started to take notice of the improvements on Eleanor's land. Several rode by on one pretext or another, ostensibly to check on boundary lines or ask about stray cattle, but really to get a look at the stranger who had moved in with the Hartley girl. Eleanor could see the speculation in their eyes, the assumptions they were making, and it made her angry. But James just tipped his hat politely and went back to work, unbothered by their scrutiny. Let them talk, he said, when Eleanor complained about it. They will see soon enough that you are making this place work. That is all that matters. One cold afternoon in mid-November, Eleanor was in the barn organizing tack when she heard raised voices from the yard. She hurried outside to find James confronting 2 men on horseback. She recognized them immediately, Tom Brennan and his son Danny from the spread 3 miles to the east. Tom Brennan had been one of the ranchers who had offered to buy her out, making it clear that he thought she was in over her head. I am telling you again, we do not want any trouble, James was saying, his voice level but with an edge to it that Eleanor had never heard before. Miss Hartley's cattle have not been on your land. I have got 3 head missing, Tom Brennan said, his face red with anger. And I know you have been moving cattle around. Seems awful convenient that mine go missing right when you show up. Eleanor felt her own anger flare. She stepped forward, placing herself next to James. My herd is accounted for, Mr. Brennan. Every single head. If you are missing cattle, you should check your own fences before you come here making accusations. Danny Brennan, a young man about Eleanor's age with his father's blunt features and mean eyes, sneered at her. Everyone knows you were barely hanging on, Ellie. Maybe you got desperate, figured taking a few of our steers would not matter. Get off my land, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with fury. Right now. Tom Brennan leaned forward in his saddle, his expression ugly. You are making a mistake, girl, shacking up with some drifter and thinking you can run a ranch. When you lose this place, and you will, do not come crying to me looking for help. James's hand shot out and grabbed the bridle of Tom's horse, his other hand resting on the gun at his hip. His voice, when he spoke, was cold as ice. The lady asked you to leave. I suggest you do it. For a moment, Eleanor thought there was going to be violence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and she could see Danny's hand moving toward his own gun. But Tom Brennan was a bully, not a killer, and he recognized the look in James's eyes. He jerked his horse's head free and spat into the dirt. This is not over, he said. We will see how long you last out here. They rode off, and Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking, and she clenched them into fists to stop the trembling. James turned to her, his expression softening with concern. Are you all right? I am fine, Eleanor said, though she was anything but. He has been trying to drive me off this land since my father died. He wants my water rights. The creek that runs through here feeds into his property, and he wants control of it. James's jaw tightened. He is not going to get it. We are going to make this place work, Eleanor. I promise you that. The certainty in his voice, the way he said we as if they were a team, a unit, made Eleanor's eyes sting with sudden tears. She blinked them back and nodded. Thank you, she said, for standing up for me, for not backing down. I would never let anyone hurt you or take what is yours, James said fiercely. This land is worth fighting for, and so are you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor looked up at James, at the man who had appeared in the rain 6 weeks ago and changed everything, and felt her heart crack open with something that felt terrifyingly like love. She had not been looking for this, had not wanted to risk her heart when she was already risking everything else, but here it was anyway, undeniable and overwhelming. "James," she started, but did not know how to finish. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are we doing?" she whispered. "I cannot afford to lose myself in something that might not last. I have too much at stake." "Then maybe we make it last," James said. "Maybe we build something together, something real and strong enough to weather whatever comes. I am not going anywhere, Eleanor, not unless you tell me to go." Eleanor searched his face, looking for doubt or deception, but found only honesty and a hope that matched her own. "I do not want you to go," she admitted. "I have not wanted you to go since the day you showed up. That terrifies me." "It terrifies me too," James said, and smiled. "But I think maybe the best things in life are the ones that scare us a little. They are the ones worth having." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet, a question and an answer all at once, and Eleanor felt the world narrow down to the warmth of his lips on hers and the strength of his arms as they came around her. She kissed him back, pouring into it all the loneliness and fear and desperate hope she had been carrying for so long. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Hartley," he said. "Have been since that first day, watching you fight that fence in the rain. You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you do not have to do it all alone." Eleanor's tears spilled over then, tracking down her cheeks. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could, did not think I had room in my life for anything but survival. But you made me want more. You made me believe that maybe I could have more." They held each other there in the yard as the sun began to sink toward the mountains and the cold wind picked up, and Eleanor felt something shift deep inside her. She had been so focused on holding on not losing what her father had built, that she had forgotten what it meant to build something new. But with James, she could see a future that was more than just survival. She could see happiness, partnership, love. She could see a life worth living. That night, they sat together on the porch as usual, but everything had changed. James held Eleanor's hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her palm, careful of the healing cuts. They talked about the future, about what it would take to make the ranch profitable again, about their dreams and fears. Eleanor told James that she wanted children someday, wanted to fill the cabin with noise and laughter. James told her that he wanted to expand the herd, maybe build a bigger house, grow old watching the sun rise over these mountains. "We could really do it," Eleanor said, half wondering, half believing. "We could make this place everything my father wanted it to be." "We will," James said firmly, "together." The next few weeks were a blur of hard work and growing intimacy. James and Eleanor labored side by side, preparing the ranch for winter. And in the quiet moments between tasks, they stole kisses and whispered promises. Eleanor had never been courted before, had never had time or opportunity for romance, but James made her feel cherished in a way she had not known was possible. He brought her wildflowers he found on the range, braided into makeshift bouquets. He rubbed her sore shoulders at the end of long days, his strong hands gentle and sure. He made her laugh with stories and observations, and he listened, truly listened, when she talked about her hopes and dreams. In early December, the first real snow came, blanketing the ranch in white. Eleanor and James spent a frantic day driving the cattle down from the high pasture and making sure all the animals had adequate shelter. By the time they finished, they were both exhausted and half frozen, but the sense of accomplishment was exhilarating. That night, as they stood in the barn shaking snow from their coats, James pulled Eleanor into his arms and kissed her deeply. "Marry me," he said when they came up for air. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I am sure about this, about you. I want to build a life with you, Eleanor. I want this ranch to be ours, together. Say yes." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Every rational part of her brain told her this was crazy, that she barely knew this man, that she should be cautious and sensible, but her heart knew differently. Her heart knew that James Coulter was the best thing that had ever happened to her, that he had saved her in more ways than just mending a fence. He had given her hope and help and love, and she wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of her life with him. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." James let out a whoop of joy and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with happiness. "I do not have a ring," he said. "I do not have much of anything to offer you except hard work and a promise that I will love you every day for the rest of my life." "That is all I need," Eleanor said. "That is everything." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in the nearest town, a dusty settlement called Clearwater that was 10 miles from the ranch. Eleanor wore the best dress she owned, a simple blue wool that had been her mother's, and James wore a clean shirt and his only suit jacket. There were no guests except for the preacher's wife, who served as witness, and a cowhand from a neighboring ranch who happened to be in town. It was small and quiet and perfect. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "Mrs. Coulter," he murmured against her lips, and Eleanor felt a thrill of joy at the sound of her new name. They rode back to the ranch through the snow, James's arm around Eleanor's waist, and began their life together. That first winter was hard. The snows were heavy and the cold was brutal, and there were days when they could barely keep ahead of the work. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. James's strength complemented Eleanor's determination, and his experience filled in the gaps in her knowledge. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, learned to work as a seamless team. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire in the cabin, Eleanor mending or knitting, while James carved small wooden animals that he planned to give to their future children. They talked about everything, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their future. James told Eleanor about his childhood in Texas, about the uncle who had taught him to rope and ride, about the day he had decided to head north and try his luck in the Wyoming territory. Eleanor told James about her mother, about the dim memories she had of a gentle woman who had sung lullabies and smelled like lavender, about the way her father had done his best to fill the void, but could never quite replace a mother's love. "Our children will have both parents," James promised. "They will grow up knowing they are loved and wanted, and they will have this land to call home." As winter began to loosen its grip and spring approached, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told James on a sunny March morning in 1883, as they stood together watching the first green shoots pushing up through the melting snow. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Shock and joy and fierce protectiveness all rolled into one. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and then set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands on her shoulders. "I am sure," Eleanor said, her own joy bubbling up. "We are going to have a baby." James pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor, I promise you, I am going to be the best father I can be. Our child will never want for anything, not love, not security, not a future." "I know," Eleanor said. "I have never doubted that." The pregnancy motivated them both to work even harder to secure the ranch's future. They spent the spring repairing and improving, expanding the garden plot so Eleanor could preserve more food, and carefully managing the small herd. In May, several of the cows dropped calves, and for the first time in over a year, Eleanor felt like the ranch was growing instead of shrinking. James was attentive and protective as Eleanor's belly began to swell. He insisted on taking over the heaviest chores, though Eleanor argued that she was pregnant, not fragile. But she secretly loved his concern, loved the way he would rest his hand on her stomach in the evenings and talk to their unborn child, telling stories about the ranch and the adventures they would have together. As summer arrived and Eleanor grew rounder, they faced their first real test as a married couple. Tom Brennan, still angry about his confrontation with James the previous fall, began spreading rumors in town that James was a cattle thief and that Eleanor's pregnancy was proof of her loose morals. The gossip was vicious and hurtful, and there were days when Eleanor wanted to ride into Clearwater and confront every person who had whispered about her. But James counseled patience. "They are just words," he said. "Words cannot hurt us unless we let them. We know the truth, and that is what matters. Let the ranch speak for itself. When people see what we have built here, they will know the lies for what they are. He was right. By the end of the summer, the improvements to the ranch were obvious to anyone who passed by. The fences were all repaired and strengthened, the buildings were in good shape, and the cattle were healthy and multiplying. Several of the more reasonable neighbors began to stop by, ostensibly to ask for advice or borrow tools, but really to acknowledge that Eleanor and James were making a success of things. Even some of those who had believed the rumors began to change their minds. Eleanor gave birth on a cold November night, almost exactly a year after James had proposed. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town, who James had ridden through a snowstorm to fetch. Eleanor labored for nearly 18 hours, and there were moments when she thought she could not go on, when the pain was too much and fear overwhelmed her. But James never left her side. He held her hand and wiped her forehead with cool cloths and told her over and over that she was strong, that she could do this, that he loved her. When their son finally entered the world, red-faced and squalling, Eleanor wept with relief and joy. James cut the cord with shaking hands, and when the midwife placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, he sat beside her on the bed and stared at the tiny life they had created with wonder written all over his face. "He is perfect," James whispered, touching one tiny fist with a gentle finger. "Eleanor, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel, after Eleanor's father, and the baby became the center of their world. James was a devoted father from the very first day, getting up in the night to change diapers and walking the floor with Samuel when he was fussy. Eleanor would watch her husband cradling their son, singing soft lullabies in his deep voice, and feel her heart overflow with love. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. That spring, they sold a dozen head of cattle at a good price, and for the first time since her father's death, Eleanor had money in the bank. They used some of it to buy better breeding stock, and some to expand the cabin, adding 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. James built furniture with his own hands, including a beautiful cradle for Samuel that he carved with images of horses and mountains. As Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler, he became his father's shadow, following James around the ranch with determined little steps. James was endlessly patient, teaching his son about animals and the land, letting him help with chores, even when it made the work take twice as long. Eleanor would watch them together and feel a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what her father had wanted for her, she realized. Not just to keep the ranch, but to fill it with love and family and future. In the summer of 1885, when Samuel was almost 2, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she was able to work alongside James for most of it, chasing after their active toddler and managing the growing demands of the ranch. They had added more cattle and several horses, and James had developed a reputation as a skilled horse trainer. People from neighboring ranches began bringing him animals to work with, and the additional income allowed them to hire seasonal help during the busiest times. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born on a warm April evening. The birth was faster than Samuel's, and by morning, Eleanor was sitting up in bed nursing the baby, while Samuel climbed up beside her to meet his new sister. James sat with his arm around Samuel, watching his family with an expression of such profound happiness that Eleanor had to blink back tears. "We did it," she said softly. "We built everything we dreamed of." "We did," James agreed, "and we are not done yet. This is just the beginning, Eleanor. This ranch, our family, it is going to last. We are building something that will outlive us, something Samuel and Rose can pass on to their own children someday." Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic with 2 small children, but filled with laughter and love. The ranch continued to thrive. By 1887, they had tripled the size of the original herd and expanded their land holdings by purchasing an adjacent 40 acres from a rancher who was retiring. The cabin had grown into a proper ranch house, with a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the children play. Tom Brennan, whose own ranch had struggled in recent years, eventually swallowed his pride and came to James for advice. It was a tense conversation, but James was gracious, sharing what he knew about herd management and water conservation. Afterward, the hostility between the 2 families eased, and while they never became close friends, they developed a neighborly respect. As the children grew, Eleanor taught them about the land and the importance of hard work, just as her father had taught her. Samuel, serious and thoughtful, loved the cattle and dreamed of expanding the herd even further. Rose, spirited and fearless, loved the horses, and spent every spare moment in the barn with her father. Both children grew up knowing they were loved and valued, that the ranch was their heritage and their responsibility. In the summer of 1890, Eleanor and James celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary by taking the children on a camping trip up into the mountains that overlooked their land. They spent 3 days exploring and fishing and telling stories around the campfire, and on the last night, as they lay in their tent with the children sleeping between them, James took Eleanor's hand. "Do you remember that day I found you mending fences in the rain?" he asked quietly. "Every detail," Eleanor said. "I was at the end of my rope, ready to give up, and then you appeared out of nowhere and saved me." "We saved each other," James corrected. "You gave me a reason to stop drifting, a place to belong. You gave me a family and a future. I have never regretted a single moment since that day." "Neither have I," Eleanor said. "Even the hard parts, even the struggles, I would not change any of it, because it brought us here, to this." They fell silent, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of a night bird. Eleanor thought about that desperate woman she had been 8 years ago, fighting a losing battle against circumstance and weather and her own limitations. She had been so alone, so afraid. But James had seen past all of that to the strength underneath. He had believed in her when she could barely believe in herself, and he had given her the help she needed to survive. But more than that, he had given her love. Real, deep, lasting love that had grown and evolved through years of partnership and parenthood. They had built something extraordinary together, a ranch that prospered and a family that thrived. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness, with a cowboy taking wire from bleeding hands and mending a fence in the rain. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. There were drought years and harsh winters, years when the cattle prices were low and money was tight. But Eleanor and James faced it all together, their bond growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. They added a 3rd child in 1892, another boy they named Matthew, who had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes. The ranch became known as one of the most successful small operations in the county. James's reputation as a horseman brought buyers from as far away as Montana, and Eleanor's careful management of the finances ensured they weathered the economic downturns that ruined many of their neighbors. They were respected in the community, sought out for advice and assistance, and their home was always open to those in need. As Samuel grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, he took on more and more responsibility for the cattle operation. Rose, beautiful and determined, insisted on learning every aspect of ranching and shocked the neighbors by riding in the local rodeos. Matthew, the baby, was quieter than his siblings, more interested in books and learning, and Eleanor and James encouraged his education, driving him to school in Clearwater and dreaming of the day he might go to university. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Eleanor and James stood on the porch of their ranch house and looked out over the land they had built together. They were both in their early 40s now, weathered by hard work and the harsh Wyoming climate, but still strong and vital. Samuel, 17 now, was out checking the herd with 2 hired hands. Rose, 15, was in the barn working with a young mare. Matthew, 8, was inside doing his lessons. 18 years, Eleanor said, leaning against James's side. 18 years since you rode up and changed my life. James wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Best 18 years of my life, he said. Though I have to admit, sometimes I still cannot believe how far we have come. That day I found you, this place was barely hanging on. Look at it now. Eleanor looked. The ranch sprawled across several hundred acres now, with a healthy herd of over 200 cattle and a barn full of excellent horses. The house was large and comfortable, filled with the evidence of their life together, children's drawings on the walls, James's carvings on every surface, Eleanor's quilts and preserves. The land was well tended and productive, and they had money in the bank and a future secured. "We did this together," Eleanor said. "I could never have done it alone." "You were doing it alone," James reminded her. "You were fighting like hell to keep this place alive. I just gave you a hand when you needed it." Eleanor smiled and reached up to touch his weathered face. "You gave me so much more than that. You gave me hope. You gave me love. You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have." James turned and kissed her, a kiss that still held all the passion and tenderness of their early days together. "And you gave me a home," he said, "a place to belong, a reason to keep going. Everything I am, everything I have, is because of you." They stood together in the golden evening light, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, and Eleanor felt a deep, abiding gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought James Coulter to her fence line on that rainy October day. She had been at her lowest point, bleeding and desperate, and he had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak. He had taken the wire from her hands and finished the work. But he had done so much more than that. He had healed her heart and rebuilt her hope. He had stood beside her through every challenge and celebrated every victory. He had given her children and laughter and love that would last beyond their lifetimes. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor and James grew old together on the land they loved. They watched their children grow up and start families of their own. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from the next county over and built a house on the north section of the property, expanding the cattle operation even further. Rose married a cowboy she met at a rodeo, a good man who respected her spirit and her skills, and they started a horse breeding program that became famous throughout the territory. Matthew went to university in Laramie, as his parents had hoped, and became a teacher, though he always came home for summers to help on the ranch. Eleanor and James became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, watching their family tree grow and spread. The ranch house was always full of visiting children and grandchildren, of noise and laughter and life. And through it all, through every change and evolution, Eleanor and James remained partners. They still walked the fence lines together, still sat on the porch in the evenings talking about the day. They still reached for each other in the night, still found comfort and joy in each other's presence. In the spring of 1925, as Eleanor approached her 66th birthday, James took her hand and led her out to the spot where they had first met. The fence line was different now, the posts newer, and the wire in better shape, but the location was the same. It was a warm afternoon, with the kind of gentle rain that nourished rather than punished, and Eleanor stood there with James's arm around her and remembered. "I think about that day often," James said, his voice still carrying that soft drawl she had fallen in love with. "The way you looked, so fierce and determined, fighting that wire even though your hands were bleeding. I knew right then that you were someone special, someone worth knowing." "I was terrified when I saw you," Eleanor admitted. "I thought you might be there to cause trouble or to take advantage of my situation. But you just wanted to help, that was all, just help. And you let me," James said. "Even though it was hard for you, even though you had learned not to trust anyone, you let me help. That took more courage than I think you knew." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. They were both gray now, their bodies marked by decades of hard work, but the love between them was as strong as ever. Stronger even, tempered by time and tested by challenges. "I would do it all again," Eleanor said. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every fear. I would do it all again to end up here, with you, with this life we built together." "So would I," James said. "Marrying you, building this ranch, raising our family. It has been the greatest adventure of my life. I could not have asked for anything more." They stood there in the gentle rain, holding each other, and Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. She had started out alone, desperate and afraid, trying to hold on to her father's legacy with bleeding hands and sheer determination. But she had not had to do it alone. James had come into her life when she needed him most, and together they had created something far greater than either of them could have achieved separately. The ranch would go on long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren would tend the land and the cattle, would walk these fence lines and sit on that porch and tell stories about the woman who had refused to give up and the cowboy who had stopped to help her. The legacy Eleanor had fought so hard to preserve had not only survived but flourished, growing into something that would touch generations to come. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Eleanor looked out over the land and felt nothing but gratitude. For her father, who had taught her to be strong, for the rain that had brought James to her, for the wire that had cut her hands and forced her to accept help, for every moment of struggle that had led her to this place of peace and joy. But most of all, she was grateful for James, for the man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, for the partner who had worked beside her for over 40 years, for the husband who had kept every promise he had ever made, for the father who had raised their children with patience and wisdom, for the friend who had listened and laughed and shared every moment of this extraordinary life. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the sound of family, Eleanor took James's hand and held it tight. His hands were as weathered and scarred as her own now, marked by a lifetime of honest work. But they were the hands that had taken the wire from her that rainy day, the hands that had mended the fence and, in doing so, had mended her broken heart. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you from that first day, and I will love you until my last." James squeezed her hand and smiled, his eyes crinkling with the deep lines of a life well lived. "And I love you, Eleanor Coulter. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You are my home." They sat together as the stars came out, talking and laughing with their family. And Eleanor knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfection, not ease, but a life built on love and hard work and determination. A life that had started with a simple act of kindness and grown into something beautiful and lasting. The ranch would endure, the family would thrive, and the story of the woman mending fences in the rain and the cowboy who stopped to help her would be told for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the smallest gestures, that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to reach out, to take the burden from bleeding hands and to say, "You do not have to do this alone." Eleanor and James lived out their remaining years together on the ranch they had built, surrounded by the family they had created, and the land they had tended with such devotion. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1932, an event that brought family and friends from across the state to honor the couple who had become legendary in their community. The party lasted 2 days, with music and dancing and stories shared about the early days when Eleanor had been alone and struggling, and James had appeared out of the rain like a guardian angel. When James passed away peacefully in his sleep, in the winter of 1935, at the age of 76, Eleanor grieved deeply, but without regrets. They had had 43 years together, years filled with more love and adventure and fulfillment than most people experienced in a lifetime. She sat at his funeral and held her children's hands and told stories about their father, about his kindness and strength and unwavering commitment to family. Eleanor lived for another 5 years, remaining active on the ranch almost until the end. She died in the spring of 1940 at the age of 81, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and James had created. Her last words were about the fence line, about the rain, about the day a cowboy had taken wire from her bleeding hands and changed everything. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through Samuel and then to his children and grandchildren. The original house was preserved and expanded, and a stone marker was placed at the fence line where Eleanor and James had first met. Carved into the stone were simple words: "Here is where love began," built on hard work, trust, and hands that reached out to help when help was needed most. Over the decades, the story of Eleanor Hartley and James Coulter became part of local legend, told to children and grandchildren as an example of what could be built when 2 people committed to each other and to a dream. Young couples would visit the marker and make wishes for their own relationships, hoping to find the kind of lasting love that Eleanor and James had shared. The ranch continued to prosper through wars and depressions, through droughts and economic downturns, always guided by the principles Eleanor and James had established: hard work, fair dealing, commitment to family, and stewardship of the land. Each generation added to the legacy, but none forgot the foundation upon which it was built. And on rainy autumn days, when the wind blew cold across the Wyoming range and the cattle huddled together for warmth, you could almost see them if you looked closely enough. A young woman fighting with barbed wire, her hands bleeding and her determination absolute, and a cowboy on a big roan horse, stopping to help when help was needed most. You could almost hear her thanks and his quiet response, the beginning of a conversation that would last a lifetime. Because some love stories are not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Some love stories are about seeing someone at their most vulnerable and choosing to help, about taking the burden from tired hands and saying, "Let me," about building something together, piece by piece, day by day, until you look up one day and realize you have created not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of love that will outlast you both. Eleanor and James had done that. They had taken a desperate situation and turned it into triumph. They had taken 2 broken people and made them whole. They had taken a struggling ranch and turned it into a thriving enterprise that would support generations to come. But most importantly, they had taken a chance on each other, on love, on the possibility that together they could weather any storm, and they had been right. The fence line still stood, strong and true, a testament to the work they had done together. The land still flourished, green and productive, nourished by their sweat and sacrifice. And the love they had shared still echoed through the generations, a reminder that the most powerful force in the world is not strength or wealth or power, but simply this: two people choosing each other every single day and building a life together, one mended fence at a time. Their great-great-grandchildren would walk that fence line and hear the stories. They would learn about the woman who refused to give up and the man who stopped to help her. They would understand that their lives, their opportunities, their very existence was possible because on one rainy October day in 1882, a cowboy named James Coulter saw a woman named Eleanor Hartley mending fences until her hands bled, and he made the choice to take the wire and finish the work. It was a simple choice, a small moment in the vast sweep of history, but it changed everything. It saved a ranch, created a family, and built a love story that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. And in the end, is that not what we all hope for? To be remembered, to matter, to leave behind something good and true and lasting. Eleanor and James did that. They left behind a legacy of love that time could not diminish and change could not erase. They proved that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest steps, that the deepest love can grow from the simplest kindness. That two people working together with commitment and trust and unwavering devotion can build something that will last forever. And so, the story ends where it began, with a fence and a rainstorm and two people whose lives intersected at exactly the right moment, with hands that bled and hands that helped, with a woman who fought and a man who believed in her, with a ranch that survived and thrived, with children and grandchildren and generations yet to come, all made possible by a cowboy who stopped to help and a woman who led him. It was a love story for the ages, written not in words but in wire and wood and weathered hands. A love story that began with bleeding palms and ended with a legacy that would outlast them both. A love story that proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the best things in life come to us when we are at our lowest point, when we have nothing left but determination and hope. Eleanor and James found each other in that moment of desperation and need, and they spent the rest of their lives being grateful for it. They built a life together that was rich not in gold or silver, but in love and family and purpose. They created something that mattered, something that would endure long after they were gone. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the grass and the stars shine bright over the Wyoming range, you can still feel them there. Eleanor and James, together as they always were, watching over the land they loved and the family they created. Still partners, still in love, still proving that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is a life well lived and a love that never dies. The fence stands strong, the ranch endures, and the love story of Eleanor Hartley and James Coulter lives on, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of partnership, and the enduring beauty of a love that began with bleeding hands and a cowboy who stopped to help. It is a story that will be told for as long as the mountains stand and the grass grows, a reminder that sometimes all we need is someone to take the burden from our hands and say, "You do not have to do this alone." And in that moment, everything changes, everything becomes possible, and love, real and lasting and true, begins to grow.